You know, a good spin-off is a tricky balancing act to pull off. If you fail to retain enough of the original series' charm and overall feel, then you're probably gonna run off a lot of the old fans. But at the same time, if you just mindlessly mimic all the elements of the original that everybody loved, then you're bound to have people wonder why you even bothered making a spin-off in the first place. Of course, if you do manage to walk that tightrope and deliver an experience that maintains the overall appeal for its core fans, while still managing to carve out its own unique identity, then it's possible to be rewarded with something that recreates, or in a few rare cases, even exceeds the success of its parent series. Now, considering that The Sims Medieval is one of the least mentioned Sims spin-offs, it'd be easy enough to write this off as little more than a misguided cash grab by EA, but you'd be mistaken for doing so. While The Sims Medieval does suffer from some very noticeable shortcomings and questionable design choices, it's also just so full of heart, while at the same time more heavily leaning into the darkly comedic elements so many fans have come to love, and if nothing else, it certainly provides a one-of-a-kind Sims experience. Now, to be clear, The Sims Medieval is not a great game. In fact, I'm not even sure it's really a good game, as its role-playing elements are far too shallow to appeal to any serious fans of that genre, while it also provides such a stripped-down and restrictive Sims experience that it's not hard to see why it has such a hard time connecting with the average Sim player either. See, instead of dungeon crawling and monster slaying as you do in something like Final Fantasy, progressing through quests in The Sims Medieval usually just boils down to ping-ponging around your kingdom and socializing with its various residents. Saying the game aggressively holds the player's hand is an understatement. At its worst, it feels like The Sims Medieval is pulling you around on a leash as you just mindlessly have your sim do whatever hyper-specific interaction the game tells you to. Admittedly, sometimes this will require your sims to do something actually somewhat interesting, such as torture information out of a foreign emissary or participate in a duel, but like 90% of the time you'll just find yourself having a pleasant chat or heading off to do some light shopping. It's also worth pointing out that The Sims Medieval utilizes The Sims 3's game engine, which means it shares many of that title's quirks and limitations. I know rabbit holes are often considered to be somewhat of a necessary evil by many Sims players, but they don't exactly provide the epic sense of adventure that defines the best role-playing games, and it's hard not to feel at least a little disappointed when all the coolest stuff occurs off-screen and you're just left to read about it. Leveling up your heroes for the most part plays out the same as improving your skills in the main games, as the most effective method of doing so is just finding an appropriate object and instructing your sim to interact with it to gain experience, although you are also granted XP for completing your hero's daily responsibilities, and as you'd expect, finishing quests grants you a large amount each time as a reward. Again though, while your sims can learn new combat moves, spells, and what have you depending on their profession, it's nowhere near as exciting as it is in your average role-playing game, where gaining a few levels can turn what was once a seemingly impossible combat encounter into an absolute cakewalk. Now, this wouldn't be that big of a deal if the questing and dubious RPG elements were just the bells and whistles that were surrounding what was otherwise a fully fledged Sims experience, but sadly that's not the case. To start with, you're not free to hop around from sim to sim as you see fit, as what sims, or heroes as they're referred to here, that you have access to are determined by your current quest. This might not sound like a big deal, but it can be extremely annoying if you find yourself getting really attached to your spy, for example, but none of your available quests call for them to be featured. Now, I have seen that there are some cheats which let you circumvent this, but limiting the player's choices like this in the first place is certainly an odd move for a Sims game. And while your various heroes are free to get married and have kids, you can't ever control the other members of their households, and aside from babies turning into children, and children being able to inherit a dead hero's job, there isn't any aging, which can lead to your kingdom feeling a little static, which isn't helped by the fact that the various NPCs populating it serve as little more than set dressing. In most Sims games, the pre-made residents of a neighborhood all have clearly defined relationships, so if you load up The Sims 2 for instance and throw a party where you invite Cassandra Goth, Nina Caliente, and Don Lothario over, there's a good chance a whole bunch of dirty laundry is gonna get aired out. But in The Sims Medieval, aside from their profession and their current relationship with your heroes, you never really feel like you actually get to know any of the NPCs you encounter, so if you go to the tavern and see the barmaid get into a fistfight with a customer, it might be amusing, but because there's no context behind it, and you know it won't ever be followed up on in any meaningful way, chances are it's not going to stick with you in the long term. However, to some players, I know that the lack of any build tools is likely to be the most unforgivable omission. There's a whole subset of Sims players who mainly play these games just to see how far they can stretch the build mechanics in order to create the most ingenious and sometimes flat out impractical homes and businesses that you can possibly imagine. But if you were salivating at the thought of designing your own castle strongholds or taverns, then you're in for a bad time. To add insult to injury, you don't even get to decide where these buildings are placed. You just plop them down in their designated slots, which means the layout of your kingdom is going to be exactly the same as every other player's. And again, I understand that The Sims Medieval isn't exactly trying to provide your classic Sims experience, as the focus here is on completing quests, and maybe if I actually enjoyed that aspect of the game more, then I wouldn't find myself missing so many of the traditional Sims elements, but I don't, so I do. But with that not at all confusing statement having been said, I just can't find it in my heart to completely hate on any game that allows me to send someone to the stockade so that all their neighbors can pelt them with eggs and tomatoes. I mean, The Sims Medieval might sound ridiculous the first time you hear about it, but when you think about how sadistic the average Sim player is towards their helpless creations, you realize setting one of these games during that era of human history where having your blood drained with leeches was a routine medical procedure just makes absolute perfect sense. In most games, torturing some poor Sim just means finding a way to neglect their needs, which, let's be honest, 99% of the time just means deleting a door and leaving them trapped somewhere. So it's super refreshing to have a Sims game that doesn't beat around the bush and just lets you strap some poor bastard into a chair and dump water onto their face, stick an angry chinchilla onto their lap, or tickle them with a feather in an attempt to break their will. And by the same token, in most Sims games, actually killing off somebody usually comes down to either just starving them out, or if you're feeling somewhat more creative, doing your best to set up some quote-unquote accident, and just hoping for the worst. And I totally get this, as a large part of The Sims' success is its popularity with younger players, and the series' more or less family-friendly reputation would quickly change if your Sims could just go into their neighbors' homes and flat-out murder them, no matter how cartoonishly exaggerated said murders might be. However, the medieval setting provides a level of disconnect that makes it far more acceptable to kill off your acquaintances, and it's nice to be able to permanently eliminate my enemies in one of these games without having to jump through a bunch of hoops. It also takes only about 30 seconds to realize that the whole ye old-timey aesthetic just fits the series like a glove, as these games have always excelled at coming up with lovably exaggerated caricatures. Knights, bards, spies, peasants, jesters, and more are all brought to life, and they're all decked out in era-appropriate outfits, which range from regal and distinguished to suitably grubby and ridiculous. And one of the most common complaints about The Sims 3 was that all the Sims had Clayface syndrome, and despite sharing its engine, that critique doesn't apply to The Sims Medieval. In fact, there's an argument to be made that it has the most realistic looking Sims in the entire series. On the whole, this is just a really good looking game that still visually holds up nearly 15 years after its release. The series' trademark offbeat sense of humor is also in full effect and translates to the Middle Ages perfectly, and as I alluded to earlier, the darker elements have been pushed to the forefront, which only enhances it all. Being able to taunt the leader of a hunger strike right before she starves to death, accepting bribes from one of your subjects to execute their annoying neighbor, and having the option to hunt mermaids who attempt to lure you in with their siren songs are exactly the type of twisted stuff that I want out of a Sims spin-off. Granted, when it's time to make one of those decisions, you always have the option to be far more benevolent if you're so inclined, but unfortunately for all the residents of Dustynia, there usually isn't nearly as much comedic potential in playing nice. And I'll freely admit that while I might have found most of the quests to be a bit of a chore to actually work my way through, the writing was often strong enough that I was usually genuinely interested in seeing how these stories played out. And to be fair, once I got out of the mindset that this was supposed to be an RPG, and finally accepted that it was actually just a collection of bite-sized choose-your-own-adventure books with a Sims theme, I did start to enjoy myself a little more. There are also a few fleeting moments during quests where the game actually gives you a little bit of leeway in completing one of the steps, such as when you need to acquire soul fragments from 3 people in order to free a genie, and I decided that my beloved monarch would be an ideal contributor. Not only could this play into my personal headcanon, but when I was controlling my monarch during the next quest, he actually had a negative moodlet because of the whole experience, and that's the exact type of emergent gameplay and storytelling that made me fall in love with The Sims in the first place. But while there are some fun and laughs to be had messing around with The Sims Medieval, after a handful of hours, you're pretty much have already seen everything meaningful that the game has to offer, and there's only so many times you can have your king spit in a pirate's face, make your licentious priest get more intimately acquainted with the members of their congregation, and yes, even yell the sea in a fit of rage because a whale ate your parents before it all starts to lose its appeal. Admittedly, that's a criticism that you can fairly apply to the base version of even the most beloved entries, as it always takes a couple of expansion packs before a Sims game really finds its footing. However, unlike all its siblings, The Sims Medieval would never be given the chance to come into its own. Maxis put out the one, admittedly underwhelming, Pirates and Nobles expansion before EA quietly pulled the plug on The Sims Medieval, and there hasn't been any sort of follow-up, either in the form of an official sequel or even just a medieval-themed pack for The Sims 4, for. And that's honestly a damn shame, because as rough as The Sims Medieval might be around the edges, the potential for something truly great is also so apparent that I'm honestly shocked EA has never taken another crack at the concept, especially considering how a certain divisive series had reignited the public's appetite for fantasy-themed content in the years immediately following its release. Maybe at some point in the future, EA will remedy this and we'll all look back at this first attempt more fondly and gain a new appreciation for it, but for the time being, The Sims Medieval will have to settle for being little more than a fascinating footnote in the history of one of gaming's most iconic franchises. Anyway, as always, I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you didn't, then I have no clue why I'd still be hanging around at this point and like, what the hell are you even doing? But if you did enjoy it, then why not leave a like and consider subscribing to the channel? That way you can be kept up to date with all my latest content. Or don't let me tell you how to live your life. As always, thanks for watching. I'm out.